Hello again, I'm David Gilbert. I'm a program producer at Artcore, and this is the second instalment of my kind of tour of work that I have in my house, artworks that I kind of know and love. So today what I thought I'd show you is something that I've had, I think, since about 2001, maybe 2002, which is this. It's an etching by an artist called Edwin la Dell. So this hangs in my living room most of the time, out in the Peak District where I live, and it's definitely one of my favourite pieces of work. What I think is really interesting about owning artwork is that it's why do you own it? I mean, for me, there's always a story around an artwork, and my parents ran a gallery for a long time, and that was always sort of part of owning a piece of art for people, was that it was kind of about them having a story to tell about it, having some kind of emotional relationship with a work of art, which I certainly have with this. An example of that would be if you think about going to Chatsworth, for example, which is quite near where I live. I'm not a big fan of Chatsworth, I'm honest, because it's sort of a demonstration of incredible wealth. But the idea there was that the visitors to Chatsworth, back when the Duke of Devonshire was living there and it wasn't open to the public, would be greeted at the door, and then they kind of be walked through the space. Nothing would have a label on it. It would just be an opportunity for the Duke of Devonshire of the time. The 5th Duke of Devonshire was kind of the really big art collector, I guess, to talk about his wealth, his great taste, and how well travelled he was. So we'd kind of take you through the sculpture gallery and say, oh, you know, these are some marbles that I bought when I was in Siena doing the grand tour. Or when this painting is a Rubens that I picked up, and here's a Canaletto that I picked up when I was in Venice, and so on. And it shows you blah blah blah. So it'll be all about him kind of talking about how wonderful he was and how wonderful his art was. And although I kind of don't particularly like that aspect of it, I think it is important that people have a relationship with a work of art, and certainly I do with most of the art that I have in the house. So this, as I said, by Edwin la Dell. Edwin la Dell lived 1914 to 1970, and I kind of came across his work basically because it was my first proper gallery job, really. In 1997 I got a job at Rotherham Art Gallery. It's my first job in a really kind of proper art gallery with a collection and so on. And it was a really big space. The building's now been demolished, but it was a kind of fantastic brutalist building with this enormous gallery space. So it was a real opportunity for me to experiment with what being a curator might mean and what kind of curator I might be. I wasn't fantastically interested in the collection, to be honest, because there's a lot of stuff that had just been gifted in the 1970s, so Victorian paintings. Not very good or very interesting ones, but there were a few kind of really interesting things in there where I started to dig into it. And I came across a few prints by this artist, Edwin la Dell. I didn't know anything about him at all at the time. But I started to do a bit of digging around and see what I could find out about him. I really liked the images that we had. All of them were prints, and all of them really, really interesting. Mostly from 1960s, I think, in general. So what I found out was absolutely fascinating and kind of led me to doing quite a major show of Edwin la Dell's work. So I did a catalogue for this, so I'm going to read a few bits and pieces from it just to give you a bit of background. So Edwin la Dell was born on the 7th of January 1914, and he was the elder son of a Sheffield bookbinder. The thing that I kind of found interesting about it was that he was brought up in Rotherham, and that's why we had some of his work in the Rotherham Art Gallery collection. But he'd gone to Sheffield School of Art to study on a scholarship, and then he eventually won a scholarship to the Royal College of Art. So he went there in 1935. And the teachers there were people like John Nash, Gilbert Spencer, really top artists of their day. So he studied etching, not lithography, which was something that later became his specialism, which wasn't done at the Royal College of Art at that time. But he became quite quickly a really talented and technically very adept printer. So after he left the Royal College of Art, he began to teach at Camberwell College of Art. He was commissioned to illustrate a children's book, and he started to kind of develop a bit of a reputation as an artist. His work started to be acquired for collections, like the V&A, for example, acquired quite a few of his works. And then his career was rudely interrupted by the Second World War. So he became a war artist. He volunteered initially for the civil defence, and then he became a war artist. Him and his wife Joan were living in London at this time. And the kind of interesting thing, I suppose, about the Rotherham connection was that Edwin la Dell had gone to London, been a student at the Royal College of Art, graduated and then become an artist and joined the kind of London art scene. And he sort of painted out his Yorkshire background. It was a time when it wasn't really very fashionable to be northern, so I guess he kind of painted that out and established himself as very much a kind of London-based artist. He became, as I say, one of the war artists, and he produced some really interesting work as part of that. So I discovered there was a painting in the Imperial War Museum called the Camouflage Workshop, Leamington Spa, which he painted in 1940. Really excellent painting. And then a very, very powerful ink and watercolour which he'd done called Night Train Brussels, 1944, an image of exhausted soldiers on the train coming back from the front during the Second World War. And that also was in the Imperial War Museum. So he did a lot of work during the Second World War. He'd been posted to Belgium, hence the painting, the watercolour in Brussels of soldiers on the train. But he'd also been hospitalised during the war and had severe bronchitis and a fever. So he was not sent back to the front, but he was awarded an Oak Leaf for Valour and promoted from Lance Corporal to Sergeant. Eventually he was, at the end of the war, sent to a camp on Salisbury Plain and then demobbed towards the end of the war, 16th of May 1946. So he had this sort of career as a war artist, but then immediately after the war he went back to his artistic career with a vengeance. He produced lithograph for a series called School Prints, the Tower of London, which is in the Tate Gallery collection. He was invited to make prints for a series called the Lions lithograph series, which was this was really interesting to me, this particular series of prints. The idea was that Lions tea shops were a bit of an institution. There were over 200 in England, and this series of shell lithographs was to be shown all over England in the Lions tea rooms, and they would be for sale. So the idea was that these would be contemporary artists commissioned to make work for Lions tea shops, quite sort of accessible works, and these would then be sold, I think, for a guinea. So they were really actually quite affordable. So it would be possible for people to buy a really good quality print by a British artist. So this was hugely successful, and what I found when I started looking was quite a lot of very interesting work, annotated proofs and so on, that Edwin la Dell had done. Now, the way I actually kind of came across more of his work was through a bit of detective work, really. I contacted the Royal College of Art and spoke to Chris Orr, who's the Professor of Printmaking at the Royal College of Art, and Edwin la Dell, after the Second World War, had become the Head of Printmaking at the Royal College of Art, I'd discovered. And it transpired that the current Professor of Printmaking, Chris Orr, had been taught by Edwin la Dell. So he had known him personally and been his student. And he told me that Edwin la Dell's widow, Joan, had actually died, I think, about 2 years previously. Joan had been an artist as well, not really of the same stature as Edwin, but she had been apparently quite jealous of his success, and so she hadn't allowed an exhibition of his work since 1974, not long after Edwin la Dell's death. So Chris Orr at the Royal College of Art told me that Edwin la Dell's son Tom actually lived in the house in Kent, in a place called Grafty Green, which had been Edwin la Dell's house. So Edwin and Joan had lived there, and he'd commuted in on the train to London to teach at the Royal College of Art for many years. So he managed to give me a phone number for Tom la Dell, and I contacted him, and he was very enthusiastic about the idea of doing an exhibition of his father's work. So I set off on the train down to Kent, went out to visit Tom and his wife Maria. So in one of he actually owned two houses, Edwin la Dell, and him and his wife lived sort of separately and together. They had a house each. So Tom la Dell, his son, still had the two houses, and in one of them he had a landscape architecture business. So that's what he does for a living now, quite a successful landscape architecture business. So Tom showed me a plan chest he had downstairs in the offices of his landscape architecture business, which was absolutely jammed full of prints, artist proofs, sketchbooks, all sorts of material. I mean, literally, it was a totally full a great big plan chest, completely full of work. And in there were, as I say, there were signed, editioned prints, but there were also artist proofs. There were annotated proofs where he'd made notes for the lithographer at the Royal College of Art, the technician who was pulling his prints for him. And there were annotated versions of the Lions lithographs as well, where he'd made really extensive notes. So when I put together the exhibition, I was able to use this huge stash of fantastic stuff. Tom was a really lovely man, and him and his wife actually came up to stay with me. I was living in Sheffield at the time, during the time that we had the exhibition at Rotherham. So it was quite a large-scale exhibition. It also toured to Maidstone and to Doncaster. He had kind of links with Doncaster, so Doncaster Museum and Art Gallery showed it as well. So there was kind of really interesting narrative to the whole story of Edwin la Dell's work. So he'd been teaching at the Royal College of Art since 1948, and he was kind of a recognised expert in the field, and he taught a lot of the great British post-war artists, people like John Piper, Graham Sutherland and so on. So there was a fantastic buzz around the print room, the lithography studio at that time, with all these artists who Edwin la Dell was teaching and working with. So he eventually retired to Grafty Green, and what I found here in his kind of late work, which was not prints, was an absolutely fantastic set of paintings. So he painted around and also made really kind of whole series of prints around Grafty Green, but there were these fantastic oil on board paintings which Tom la Dell had around the house, and some other sets which I'd only seen partial versions of. So for example, a set of prints from America, when he travelled to America and made some fantastic, really dynamic prints in New York. There was a trip in a holiday that he and Joan took in 1968, so kind of fairly late in his life, I guess. As I say, he died in 1971. So these were kind of fantastic prints, and the exhibition was really successful. I produced a catalogue for it. You can kind of see the catalogue for it from that exhibition back in 2001. And Chris Orr, who was the professor at the Royal College of Art, who'd been taught by Edwin la Dell as he was his student, was very, very kind and wrote an introduction to the catalogue. So I'm just going to read that for you because I think it's rather kind of lovely little piece. He writes, Somewhere in somebody's attic is an 8mm film taken in 1967 at Edwin la Dell's house in the aptly named Grafty Green, Kent, on a trip by his final year students at the printmaking department at the Royal College of Art. The film records a wonderful boozy lunch on an English summer's day. I was one of those students, and the event fixes in my mind the style of Eddie's teaching and of his art. Generous and sympathetic, he personified the painter-printmaker with a delight in colour and light. The scene of that lunch is suffused with splashes of sunlight and the rich dark colours of plants and furniture. We seem to be sitting in one of his works. Like other artists of his generation, he had his eyes wide open to the world around him. No subject was out of bounds. It was not, however, a topographical art. It dealt in the qualities and sensations of things. The description and figuration served a greater purpose than local literal information. His pictures flutter with air and restless movement. His use of lithography reflected French influences rather than the brooding English tradition of etching. There was a touch of the bon vivant in his work, an optimistic notion that the world around us was to be looked at and enjoyed. Eddie had taken over from Julian Trevelyan as head of the printmaking department at a time when London and the Royal College of Art were going through the swinging 60s. Recent graduates had included David Hockney, Peter Blake and Derek Boshier, and many students saw themselves as set on a course to challenge the accepted way of doing things. Printmaking was to play a decisive role in this. Artists embraced the democratic and inclusive qualities of existing and new technologies, and there followed a golden age for the original print. The printmaking department under Edwin la Dell's sensuous liberalism was of profound importance in that era, and in subsequent developments to the present day. And that is so true that Edwin la Dell was absolutely central to the revival of printmaking in Britain, particularly in England after the Second World War, and to that kind of democratisation of art that comes about through printmaking, the ability for people from all walks of life to be able to own original artworks. So for me it was an absolute pleasure to do the exhibition. I loved the work, the narrative around this kind of Yorkshire-born lad who got a scholarship to the Royal College of Art, reinvented himself as a London-based artist, went through the Second World War, both as a soldier and as an artist, producing some powerful artworks during which to kind of illustrate aspects of the Second World War, and then became absolutely pivotal to the London art scene, particularly that revival of printmaking. So the exhibition toured around and I became good friends with Tom Liddell, Edwin's son, and his wife Maria. So after the exhibition had finished its tour, Tom asked me if he could gift me one of Edwin la Dell's prints, which was absolutely incredibly generous of him, of course. So he said if I wanted to select one, I could have a copy of any that they had more than one of, and obviously not a painting, but one of the prints. So after quite a bit of thought, I settled on this one, Green Lily, which is an etching, so it's not entirely typical of the lithography which Edwin was so well known for and which he promoted so wonderfully during his lifetime. But it was an image I particularly liked. It's got a kind of mystery about it. The scene is at Grafty Green, it's in the conservatory, and the lily stands in the foreground with a kind of suggestion of this wild vegetation, all sorts of plants dangling and entwining themselves around the conservatory, and this little figurative sculpture just peeping through, which is still in the conservatory. I saw it when I went down to visit, so I recognised the scene. Obviously the lily wasn't there as it had been in the original image, but the scene was kind of familiar to me. I love the sort of mystery and the detail in this. So you can see the tiniest marks in the etching, on the etching plate which Edwin la Dell made, and all in all I think it's just a wonderful image which I look at, I think, every day. When I'd decided on it, Tom was coming up to Leeds where I was then working. He was doing some lecturing at the university in Leeds on landscape architecture, so we arranged to meet up for lunch and to have a chat, which was really nice. It was lovely to see him. And so he had a tube, and inside the tube was this rolled up print. So after we'd had lunch, he asked me if I'd like to see it, and of course I said yes, I'd love to. He took it out, unrolled it onto the table in the restaurant we were at, and it was a beautiful print, just as I remembered it. But there was something I noticed slightly strange about it, and I said to him, "This isn't your father's signature, is it?" And he admitted that no, he'd actually faked his father's signature. It was an original print, but it had been unsigned, so he had signed it for me with a kind of facsimile of his dad's signature. So for me, this just adds to the story of the image for me, and I kind of love that about it, that now it's something that I've had in my life for a long period of time, since 2001, so 19 years or so, and that is, the faking of the signature is an absolutely essential part of making it a work of art which I have such a strong relationship with. So I hope you like the image too, and maybe I'll show you something else from my collection of stuff soon.